So here we are back again, and we're still talking about these levels of organization in ecology. And as I was saying in the first video, you probably are going to need to write down some definitions for these other levels, because you might not know the definitions for organisms, populations, communities, and so on. So an organism, you probably know, is just a single organism, a single creature that we're talking about. And it builds on there, just like cells made tissues and tissues made organs and organs made systems. A group of organisms is called a population. Now, you want to write down in your definition that a population is a group of organisms of a single species. And by definition, a species has to be able to reproduce. So it has to be a very closely related species and only one species in that group. That makes a population. Several populations put together makes a community. So a community is several different species in a group of organisms. Next is an ecosystem. An ecosystem is special, and what you want to write down is that it's the first level of organization that takes into account both living and non-living factors. Now we call this biotic and abiotic. So organisms together make a population, and several populations of organisms make a community. The ecosystem takes into account the community, all of those different species. That's the biotic factors, the living things. And it also takes into account abiotic factors, or the non-living components in the ecosystem. So abiotic factors would be things like temperature, precipitation. Make sure you write down at least one example of an abiotic factor in your notes so that you can use that when you're studying for the test. Back over to our list then, if you put ecosystems that are close together into a group, you get what's called a biome. And you guys are familiar with biomes. The definition for a biome is a large geographic area with similar characteristics. A large geographic area with similar characteristics. So, like I said, you're familiar with these biomes. Biomes are things like rainforests, deserts, tundras. So large areas that have similar rainfall and similar temperature patterns throughout the year. And if you put all the biomes on the planet together, then you get the biosphere. The biosphere is the sum total of all the living things on the planet and all the areas where they can live. But the biosphere is not actually very big. You want to write that down, make yourself that note. The biosphere would be like approximately the thickness of a layer of paint on a basketball. So if you imagine how big a basketball is and just a layer of paint on the outside, that's about how much, when we scale up to the Earth, how much of an area life can actually survive. So it really just survives on the surface, a few meters down into the ground and a few kilometers up into the air. Now, if we go back to the theme here, it says properties emerge at various levels of organization. And we call this emergent properties. So as we go through the levels of organization, we'll see different properties emerge. And the property that we're most concerned with has to do with cells. So that's why we put it here. And we want to make sure we make the note that cells are the first level that's considered to be alive. So molecules and organelles make up cells, but an organelle on its own, or a molecule on its own, is not considered to be living. So the first time we see that property of life emerge is at the cellular level. And then there will be other emergent properties in the rest of the levels as we go along. Okay, but I'm most concerned with you remembering that the cells are the first level that's considered to be alive, and that's an emergent property. The second major theme that your book talks about is that living organisms interact with their environment. And this interaction has a lot to do with the energy that organisms are trying to obtain. So let's mark that down. This interaction has a lot to do with the energy that organisms are trying to obtain. Organisms can basically get energy in one of two ways. They can either make the energy on their own, and that's called a producer, or they can get the energy by eating another organism, and that's called a consumer. Now, you need to know the other terms for these. A producer is also called an autotroph,